Picture this. It's the spring of 1942, and the Atlantic Ocean has become a killing field. Every 24 hours, on average, 5 Allied ships disappear beneath the waves. Torpedoes strike without warning. Convoys scatter in panic. Oil slicks mark the graves of merchant vessels that will never reach their destination. In Washington, in the newly constructed halls of American naval intelligence, officers gather around maps studded with pins. Red pins marked last known U-boat positions. Black pins marked sunken ships. And every morning, there are more black pins than the day before. The numbers are staggering, catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, German submarines will sink over 500 Allied ships off the American coast. The waters from Maine to Florida are littered with wreckage. Bodies wash ashore on beaches where families used to vacation. At night, people living in coastal towns can see the glow of burning tankers on the horizon. American commanders are desperate for answers. How are the Germans doing this? How do they always seem to know exactly where the convoys will be? It's as if the enemy has a crystal ball, as if they can predict every movement, every route, every desperate attempt to evade them. What these American officers don't yet fully comprehend, what will fundamentally transform their understanding of modern warfare, is that they're not just fighting submarines, they're fighting mathematics. They're fighting a machine so sophisticated, so ingeniously designed, that the Germans believe it has made their communications absolutely invulnerable to enemy interception. The machine is called Enigma. And the story of how it was conquered, how America came to understand its significance, and how that understanding would reshape intelligence gathering and give birth to the computer age, that story begins not with admirals or generals, but with a businessman trying to protect corporate secrets in the chaos of post-war Germany. This is how the Enigma machine shocked the United States. Let's rewind the clock. The year is 1918. The Great War has just ended, leaving Europe in ruins, and Germany in particular, devastated by defeat. The Treaty of Versailles is about to impose crushing terms on the German nation. Cities are filled with returning soldiers who have no jobs to return to. The economy is in free fall. But in Berlin, in a modest office cluttered with electrical equipment and engineering diagrams, a man named Arthur Scherbius is working on something that has nothing to do with war. Scherbius is an engineer, a practical man concerned with practical problems. He's thinking about businesses, banks, corporations trying to protect their secrets in an age of telegraphs and long-distance communication. Here's the problem he's trying to solve. In 1918, if you're a business with offices in multiple cities or countries, you need to send messages. You might send them by telegraph, by radio, by courier. But anyone can intercept a telegram. Anyone with a radio receiver can listen to your broadcasts. Industrial espionage is rampant. Competitors steal trade secrets. Foreign agents monitor business communications. What if there was a way to encode your messages so thoroughly, so mathematically completely, that no competitor, no spy, no cryptanalyst could ever break them? Scherbius sits at his workbench and sketches the solution. A machine, an electromechanical cipher device that could scramble letters according to principles so complex that the resulting code would be, for all practical purposes, unbreakable. He calls it the Enigma machine, taking the name from the Greek word for riddle or puzzle, and in the summer of 1918 he files for a patent. The first Enigma machines are elegant devices about the size of a typewriter, housed in wooden boxes. The design is ingenious. When you press a key on the keyboard, an electrical current flows through a series of rotors. These are wheels with intricate wire connections inside them, and lights up a letter on the lampboard above. But here's the brilliant part. The rotors move with each keystroke, changing the electrical pathway every single time. Press the letter A, and it might encrypt as Q. Press A again immediately afterward, and this time it encrypts as F. Then maybe Z, then L. The pattern is constantly changing, constantly evolving. The machine never encrypts the same letter the same way twice in quick succession. But Scherbius doesn't stop there. He adds a plug board to the front of the machine, allowing operators to swap pairs of letters before they even reach the rotors, adding yet another layer of complexity to the encryption. When you do the mathematics, and someone eventually does, you discover that a 3-rotor Enigma machine with a plug board has more than 158 quintillion possible settings. To put that in perspective, if you tried one setting every second, it would take you longer than the age of the universe to try them all. Arthur Scherbius believes he's created the perfect cipher. He starts marketing his machine to businesses throughout Europe. Banks might use it to protect financial transactions. Corporations could secure their communications with foreign offices. Shipping companies could encode their routes and cargo manifests. But here's the problem. Businesses aren't buying. The Enigma is expensive. It's complicated. It requires training and careful key management. Most companies decide they don't really need that level of security. Their competitors might be nosy, but they're not running military-grade intelligence operations. Scherbius struggles to find customers. His company teeters on the edge of bankruptcy. The Enigma machine, this marvel of cryptographic engineering, seems destined to be a commercial failure. And then, in 1926, everything changes. The German Navy places an order, then the Army, then the Air Force. The military sees Enigma not as a business tool, but a weapon that will let them coordinate operations across continents and oceans without fear that their enemies can read their plans. The German military doesn't just buy Enigma machines, they improve them. They make them more complex, adding more rotors, changing the internal wiring, creating different versions for different branches of service. The Navy gets its own special variant with extra features. The Army gets another. The Luftwaffe gets a third. By the early 1930s, Enigma has become the backbone of German military communications, and German commanders have absolute confidence in it. They believe, truly believe, that their codes are unbreakable. They send messages discussing strategy, tactics, troop positions, upcoming operations, all in what they think is perfect secrecy. They're wrong. But they don't know they're wrong yet. And for a while, neither does anyone else. While Germany is falling in love with its unbreakable cipher machine, 3 young men in Warsaw are about to do something that will change the course of history. Their names are Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojicki, and Henryk Zygalski. They're mathematicians, not soldiers. They're in their 20s, brilliant but untested, working for the Polish Cipher Bureau in a nondescript building that most people walk past without a second glance. Here's what you need to understand about Poland in the 1930s. The country sits between 2 giants, Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. Poland knows, everyone in Poland knows, that another war is coming. The only question is when. And Polish intelligence understands that when the war comes, they'll need every possible advantage. So in 1932, the Polish Cipher Bureau recruits Rejewski and his colleagues from the mathematics department at Poznan University. These aren't traditional code breakers, the linguists and crossword enthusiasts who normally populate intelligence agencies. These are pure mathematicians, trained in abstract algebra and group theory. They think in symbols and equations. The Cipher Bureau gives them a task. Break Enigma. At first, it seems impossible. The Poles have intercepted German military messages. They have some technical intelligence about the machine's construction, thanks to a German trader who sold information to French intelligence, which the French then shared with Poland. But even with this information, even knowing roughly how the machine works, actually breaking the code seems like a fantasy. Remember that number, 158 quintillion possible settings. How do you even begin to attack that? Rejewski looks at the problem differently. He doesn't try to brute force the solution by testing every possible setting. Instead, he analyzes the mathematical structure of the cipher itself. He looks for patterns, for repetitions, for tiny mathematical vulnerabilities in how the Germans use the machine. And he finds something. German operators, following their radio protocols, send the message key, the rotor settings for that particular message, twice at the beginning of each transmission, encrypted with a daily key. They do this so the receiving operator can confirm they have the right settings. But this repetition creates a mathematical relationship, a vulnerability, a crack in the armor. Rejewski works on this crack for weeks, months. He fills notebooks with equations. He builds logical chains of deduction. And finally, in late 1932, he does something that the Germans believe is mathematically impossible. He breaks Enigma.
Not completely, not permanently, but he figures out the internal wiring of the rotors. He develops methods to determine the daily key settings. He shows that what the Germans think is unbreakable can, with enough mathematical insight and enough dedication, be broken. The three Polish mathematicians don't just break the code once. They develop systems to break it routinely. They build a machine called the cyclolytter to help automate part of the process. Later, they build something even more sophisticated, the bomba, named not after explosives, but after an ice cream dessert they happened to be eating when they had the breakthrough. The bomba uses 6 connected Enigma machines to rapidly test different rotor positions. For 7 years, from 1933 to 1939, Polish intelligence reads German military communications. 7 years, during which Poland knows Germany's military secrets. 7 years during which the Germans have no idea their unbreakable code has been broken. But there's a problem. The Germans keep improving Enigma. In 1938, they add 2 more rotors to the system, increasing the number of possible settings exponentially. The Polish methods still work, but they become slower, more laborious. The Poles would need dozens more bomba machines to keep up, and they don't have the resources. Meanwhile, war clouds are gathering. Hitler has annexed Austria. He's demanding the Sudetenland. Everyone can see what's coming. In July 1939, just weeks before Germany will invade Poland, Polish intelligence makes a decision that will alter the course of World War II. They invite representatives from British and French intelligence to Warsaw. In a secret meeting, they share everything. All their research, all their methods, all their breakthroughs. They give the British and French working replicas of Enigma machines. They hand over Rejewski's mathematical work. They explain how the bomba works. They transfer 7 years of cryptographic knowledge. The British representatives are stunned. They've been working on Enigma themselves at a place called the Government Code and Cipher School, without making significant progress. And here are these Polish mathematicians casually explaining that they've been reading German military messages for years. 1 month later, on September 1st, 1939, German forces invade Poland. The mathematicians flee. Rejewski, Różycki, and Zygalski escaped to France, then later to Britain, where they continue working on codes throughout the war. They save their knowledge, but lose their country. Poland will spend the next 6 years under brutal occupation. But the gift these three mathematicians gave to the Allies, the key to unlocking German communications, that gift will help win the war. The British take everything the Poles gave them and transport it to a Victorian mansion in the English countryside, about 50 miles north of London. The place is called Bletchley Park, and it's about to become the most important address in Britain. Imagine a country estate, all red brick and pseudo-Gothic architecture, surrounded by lawns and gardens, the kind of place where wealthy Victorians used to summer. Now imagine filling it with the most brilliant minds in Britain. Mathematicians, chess champions, linguists, crossword experts, engineers, and one particularly eccentric Cambridge professor who will become the most famous codebreaker in history. This is Bletchley Park in 1939. The government has quietly purchased the estate and turned it into the headquarters of a massive cryptographic operation. Officially, it's called the Government Code and Cipher School. Everyone who works there calls it Station X. The people living in the nearby villages have no idea what's happening behind those walls. They see civilians coming and going at odd hours, but no one asks questions. This is wartime Britain. Everyone has secrets. The man who will lead the effort to break the upgraded German Enigma is named Alan Turing. He's 27 years old, a Cambridge mathematician who published a revolutionary paper 3 years ago about theoretical computing machines. He's brilliant in a way that makes some people uncomfortable. He thinks differently. He speaks in a halting manner, avoiding social niceties, getting straight to the mathematical heart of problems. He has little patience for hierarchy or protocol. He once chained his coffee mug to a radiator because someone kept stealing it. He's also probably the best person in Britain for this job. Turing arrives at Bletchley Park in September 1939 and immediately begins working on the Enigma problem. The Polish methods are brilliant, but they can't keep up with the new 5-rotor naval Enigma that the German Navy started using. The number of possible settings has exploded. The old Bomba machines aren't fast enough. They need something better, something faster, something that can test rotor positions at incredible speed. They need a new kind of machine. Working with an engineer named Gordon Welkman, Turing designs what they call the bomb, spelled differently from the Polish bomba, but inspired by the same principle. The British bomb is much larger, much more complex, about 7 feet tall and weighing a ton. It uses electrical relay switches to simulate 36 Enigma machines running in parallel, testing possible settings thousands of times faster than any human could. The first bomb, named Victory, becomes operational in March 1940. It works, but it's not fast enough. They need more, many more. By 1941, Bletchley Park has dozens of bombs running day and night in buildings scattered around the grounds. By 1945, they'll have over 200, most built and operated by members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, who do the exhausting work of setting up the machines, feeding them data, and monitoring their operations. But the bombs can't work without clues. They need what cryptanalysts call cribs, probable words or phrases that might appear in a message. German operators help by being creatures of habit. They send weather reports at the same time every day, often using the same format. They begin messages with standard phrases. One operator famously ends every message with Heil Hitler, giving the Bletchley team a regular 6-letter crib. There are other sources of clues. Some come from captured equipment, some from German operators making mistakes, and some from one of the most daring and dangerous operations of the war. In May 1941, the British destroyer HMS Bulldog forces a German submarine, U-110, to surface. The U-boat crew begins to abandon ship, thinking their vessel is sinking. But it's not sinking fast enough. A British boarding party, led by Sub-Lieutenant David Baum, storms aboard the listing submarine. They're terrified. Submarines have scuttling charges that could detonate at any moment. The vessel reeks of diesel and fear. But Baum keeps his head. He searches the captain's cabin and finds it. An Enigma machine, intact, along with codebooks showing the current settings. The boarding party loads everything into bags and transfers it to the British ship. Then they watch as U-boat 110 finally sinks, taking its secrets with it. Or so the Germans will think. The captured materials give Bletchley Park months of insight into German Navy procedures. The Germans never know their code has been compromised. They never suspect that their unbreakable machine has been broken. By fall 1942, Bletchley Park is reading thousands of German messages every day. They've broken not just the military Enigma, but variant after variant, Army, Navy, Air Force, different administrative services. They've given this intelligence a code name, Ultra. It's classified above top secret. Only a handful of commanders are allowed to know it exists. And this is where America enters the story. Because up until 1941, all of this, the Polish breakthroughs, the Bletchley Park operations, the bomb machines, and the captured Enigma equipment, all of it has been happening without American involvement. The United States isn't in the war yet. American intelligence knows Germany is using cipher machines, but they don't know the full scope of what the Allies have achieved. That's about to change. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attack Pearl Harbor. America is in the war. And American intelligence is about to get a crash course into just how far behind they've fallen. When the United States enters World War II, American military intelligence is not prepared for what they're about to face, not even close. The Army has its own cryptanalysis service, the Signal Intelligence Service, led by a brilliant but under-supported cryptanalyst named William Friedman. The Navy has OP-20G, its Communications Intelligence Unit. Both organizations have done impressive work breaking Japanese codes. They'll read Japanese diplomatic messages throughout the war. But German codes, Enigma, that's a different story entirely.
American intelligence has known about Enigma since the 1920s. They've even acquired a commercial version of the machine. But they've made the same mistake many others made. They looked at that astronomical number of possible settings and concluded it was impossible to break without knowing the daily key. They didn't think in terms of mathematical vulnerabilities. They didn't approach it the way the Poles did. Now, suddenly, America is at war with Germany. U-boats are sinking ships in sight of American beaches. The U.S. Navy desperately needs to know where German submarines are, where they're going, what they're planning. And the British are reading Enigma messages that could provide exactly that information. But there's a problem. Ultra is the most closely guarded secret in Britain. The British are paranoid, reasonably so, about protecting it. They've built elaborate procedures to make sure the Germans never suspect their codes are broken. They never act on ultra-intelligence in ways that would be obvious. If they learn about a U-boat patrol area, they send reconnaissance aircraft to spot the submarines first, so the Germans think they were found by normal means, not because their codes were read. The British are terrified that if they share Ultra with the Americans, someone will make a mistake. Some American commander will act on the intelligence too obviously. The Germans will realize their communications are compromised. They'll change their procedures. The whole advantage will be lost. So in the early months of 1942, while American ships are being sunk by the hundreds, the British are extremely cautious about sharing what they know. They provide some intelligence, carefully sanitized, but they don't reveal the full scope of their code-breaking success. This creates enormous tension. American naval officers know the British have better intelligence about U-boat positions. They can tell from the way British convoys successfully avoid submarine wolf packs. But when Americans ask how the British are getting this information, the answers are vague. Various sources, they're told. Intelligence assets we can't discuss. Some American commanders start to suspect the British are holding back deliberately, trying to protect their own ships at America's expense. Relationships become strained. The trust that should exist between allies is undermined by necessary secrecy. Then, in early 1943, everything changes. The U.S. Navy establishes its own installation to work on Enigma and other Axis codes. A massive facility in Washington called the Navy Department Building, and another site at Dayton, Ohio, where they start building American versions of the bomb machines. American cryptanalysts begin training at Bletchley Park. The British finally, carefully, begin sharing the full scope of Ultra. And the American intelligence officers are absolutely shocked. Imagine being a U.S. Navy commander and suddenly learning that the British haven't just broken some German codes, they've broken them all. They're reading German military communications in near real time. They've known the positions of U-boats for months. They've been tracking German supply convoys, troop movements, strategic plans. The British have been fighting this war with an intelligence advantage so profound, it's almost like they have observers sitting in German headquarters. And the Americans have been in the dark. One naval intelligence officer, after being briefed on Ultra for the first time, reportedly sat in silence for several minutes, then asked, "How long have you been able to do this?" When told the answer, years, he understood immediately how many American lives might have been saved if the collaboration had started sooner. But here's the thing. American intelligence officers also understand why the secrecy was necessary. They see the elaborate precautions Bletchley Park takes. They learn about special means and the careful procedures for acting on ultra intelligence without revealing its source. They begin to grasp just how catastrophic it would be if the Germans discovered their codes were broken. Because by 1943, Ultra isn't just an intelligence advantage, it's become central to Allied strategy. Commanders are planning operations based on their ability to read German communications. The invasion of North Africa, the campaign in Italy, preparations for D-Day, all of it depends on maintaining this secret edge. The Americans throw themselves into the code-breaking effort with characteristic industrial determination. They don't just want to read Enigma messages, they want to build better tools to do it faster. The U.S. Navy bombs, designed by a team led by Joseph Desch at the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, end up being more advanced than the British versions. They're faster, more reliable, and by 1943, America is producing them in large numbers. American Wrens, the Navy calls them waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, operate these machines around the clock. In Dayton, hundreds of women work in a heavily guarded facility running bombs against German naval Enigma. None of them know exactly what they're doing. They're told it's important war work, but the true nature of their task remains classified. They feed paper tapes into the machines, monitor the results, and when a machine stops, indicating a possible solution, they record the settings and pass them on. They do this for hours, for days, for years, never fully understanding that they're part of one of the most important intelligence operations in history. Meanwhile, American analysts at the Navy Department Building work closely with their British counterparts via secure teletype. Messages flow between Washington and Bletchley Park constantly. "Have you tried this crib? We're seeing a possible setting change. Can you run this intercept through your bombs?" The Anglo-American intelligence partnership, rocky at first, becomes remarkably effective. And the impact on the war is dramatic. In the Atlantic, the tide turns. U-boat sinkings of Allied ships drop sharply in 1943. German submarine losses skyrocket. The wolf packs that terrorized convoys in 1942 find themselves hunted instead of hunting. Allied forces know where the U-boats are, where they're refueling, where they're going. The Germans don't understand what's changed. They think maybe the Allies have developed better radar, better submarine detection technology. They never seriously consider that Enigma might be compromised. American commanders, now fully integrated into the Ultra system, use the intelligence to devastating effect. They route convoys away from U-boat patrol lines. They position destroyer groups to ambush submarines. They target supply vessels that are keeping the U-boats operational. Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, writes in his diary that it's as if the enemy can see everything. He's right. They can. They're reading his orders almost as fast as his own submarine captains are. But Ultra does more than help win the Battle of the Atlantic. It changes everything about how America thinks about intelligence, about signals intelligence specifically. Before the war, intelligence work was seen as somewhat peripheral, something handled by small, underfunded agencies. The success of code-breaking in World War II proves that signals intelligence can be strategically decisive. It can change the outcome of battles, campaigns, entire theaters of war. This realization will reshape American intelligence services for the next 80 years. There's a strange thing about secret intelligence. When it works, nobody knows about it. The soldiers fighting in Europe and the Pacific don't know about Bletchley Park. The sailors on convoy duty don't know their routes are being chosen based on decrypted U-boat positions. The American public, reading newspapers and watching newsreels, has no idea that their country's cryptanalysts are reading enemy mail. All they see are the results. Ships that aren't sinking, battles that go unexpectedly well, enemy forces that seem to walk into traps. Let me tell you about one example, one that shows just how valuable Ultra becomes and how carefully the Allies have to protect it. It's June 1944. D-Day is approaching. The largest amphibious invasion in history is about to be launched at Normandy. Everything depends on surprise, on the Germans not knowing where and when the invasion will come. The Allies have created an elaborate deception operation, making the Germans think the invasion will hit Pas-de-Calais, the shortest distance across the English Channel. And they need the Germans to keep believing that lie, even after the real landings begin. Ultra intercepts show that the deception is working. German commanders are reading Allied fake radio traffic and buying the Calais story. Hitler has kept powerful panzer divisions in reserve near Calais, waiting for the real invasion.
If those divisions moved to Normandy in the first few days, they could push the Allied invasion back into the sea. Through Enigma decrypts, Allied commanders watch in real time as Hitler debates what to do after the Normandy landings begin. Should he move the reserve panzers to Normandy, or keep them at Calais in case this is just a feint? For crucial days, he hesitates. And the Allies know he's hesitating because they're reading his communications with field commanders. When the panzer divisions finally do get orders to move to Normandy, Allied commanders know it from Enigma decrypts before some German officers in France know it. Air forces are positioned to intercept and delay the tank columns. The Ardennes reinforcements arrive too late. The invasion succeeds. Historians will later estimate that D-Day might have failed without the intelligence provided by Ultra. But here's what the American soldiers hitting Omaha Beach don't know. Their odds of survival were improved by 3 Polish mathematicians in Warsaw, by Alan Turing at Bletchley Park, by hundreds of Wrens operating bomb bays in England and Waves in Dayton, by the careful coordination of intelligence sharing that took years to develop. The invisible victory. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, as Allied forces push across France and into Germany, Ultra continues to provide strategic advantages. Eisenhower, now aware of what's possible with signals intelligence, has a small group of intelligence officers who receive decrypts and brief him daily. He knows where German divisions are positioned, when they're planning counterattacks, how their supply situation is deteriorating. In the Pacific, American codebreakers are doing similar work against Japanese codes, including the famous breaking of the Japanese naval code JN-25 that allowed the U.S. Navy to ambush the Japanese fleet at Midway. But that's a different story. For American forces fighting in Europe, Enigma intelligence is the hidden force multiplier that helps them win. And then, in May 1945, Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. The German military, which started the war believing their communications were completely secure, never learns the truth. Even after defeat, even during interrogations, German officers don't believe Enigma was broken. They think the Allies succeeded through superior resources, better industrial production, greater manpower. The thought that their cipher system was compromised doesn't seriously occur to them. Which brings us to one of the strangest decisions of the post-war period, a decision that will shock American intelligence officers when they learn about it, a decision that shows just how valuable the British consider the Enigma breakthrough to be. At war's end, thousands of Enigma machines are captured from German military units. The British collect them, along with all the documentation, all the codebooks, all the evidence of how the system worked. And then, quietly, MI6 begins giving Enigma machines away. To whom? To Britain's former colonies, to countries in Africa and Asia and the Middle East that are gaining independence or setting up their own military forces. Here, the British say, have some perfectly good German cipher machines. They're excellent for secure communications. And these countries, grateful for the gift, start using Enigma machines for their own military and diplomatic traffic. They have no idea the British can read everything they send. The breaking of Enigma, which should have become worthless knowledge after Germany's defeat, suddenly has a second life. Britain continues reading the communications of dozens of countries for years after World War II ends. When American intelligence learns about this, and it takes a while for the full scope to become clear, there's a mix of admiration and concern. Admiration for the audacity of it, concern about what else their British cousins might not be telling them. But there's a bigger issue, a question that starts being asked in American intelligence circles in 1945 and 1946. If we can keep the breaking of Enigma secret, what else can we keep secret? What other signals intelligence capabilities might we develop that our adversaries don't know about?
The success of Ultra creates a culture of secrecy around signals intelligence that persists to this day. It establishes the principle that sources and methods must be protected at almost any cost, that intelligence derived from code breaking must be handled with extraordinary care, that sometimes you have to accept tactical disadvantages to protect strategic intelligence capabilities. It also creates institutional paranoia. Because here's what American intelligence officers realize. For years, they were the ones in the dark. The British were reading German codes while Americans were still trying to figure out if it was even theoretically possible. If it happened once, it could happen again. Maybe some other country has broken American codes and isn't telling anyone. Maybe the Russians, who were Allied partners during the war but are rapidly becoming Cold War adversaries, have cryptographic capabilities nobody suspects. This paranoia will drive enormous investment in American cryptographic security in the coming decades. It will lead to the creation of the National Security Agency. It will fund research into ever more complex encryption methods. It will, eventually, connect directly to the development of modern computing. Because there's one more piece of this story, one more way that Enigma shocks the United States. And it has to do with a machine built at Bletchley Park that almost nobody knows about. A machine that will change the world even more profoundly than the bombs did. While the bombs at Bletchley Park and Dayton are breaking Enigma, another team at Bletchley Park is working on an even harder problem. The Germans have a cipher system even more complex than Enigma, a teleprinter encryption machine called the Lorenz cipher, used by Hitler and the High Command for their most secret communications. The British call it tunny, and Enigma-breaking techniques don't work on it. To break tunny, a brilliant engineer named Tommy Flowers builds something unprecedented. A machine that uses 2,000 vacuum tubes to perform logical operations at electronic speed. It's programmable after a fashion. It can be configured to test different logical patterns against encrypted text. It operates faster than any calculating machine that's ever existed. They call it Colossus. It becomes operational in December 1943. It's not a general-purpose computer. It's designed specifically for cryptanalysis, but it's closer than anything else in the world at that time. Here's what most people don't know. Alan Turing isn't directly involved in building Colossus. He's still working on Enigma and on theoretical questions about machine intelligence. But his earlier theoretical work on what he called universal computing machines, machines that could be programmed to perform any logical operation, that work provides the conceptual foundation for what Flowers builds. And here's the really important part. After the war ends, everything about Colossus is classified. The machines are destroyed, the blueprints are locked away. Tommy Flowers is told never to speak about what he built. For decades, his contribution to computing history is completely unknown. When historians write about the development of computers in the 1940s, they talk about ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania, which becomes operational in 1946. They don't mention Colossus, which was running 3 years earlier, because nobody outside a tiny circle of British intelligence officers knows Colossus exists. American engineers building early computers after the war are in some cases reinventing things that had already been invented at Bletchley Park. They don't know this because the British aren't telling them. The knowledge is locked away behind official secrecy. But here's where it gets interesting. Some information does leak across the Atlantic through careful channels in ways that are never officially acknowledged. American intelligence officers who were briefed on Ultra during the war, who visited Bletchley Park, who saw some of the equipment, they come home with ideas, with concepts, with an understanding that electronic machines can perform logical operations at incredible speed. These ideas percolate through American military and intelligence circles. They influence the development of early American computers. When the U.S. Army funds ENIAC, when the CIA starts thinking about automated code breaking in the early Cold War, when the National Security Agency is formed in 1952 with a mission to protect American communications and break adversary codes, all of it is shaped by lessons learned from Enigma and from the broader Bletchley Park experience. There's a direct line, invisible but real, from the Polish mathematicians in Warsaw to the bombs at Bletchley Park, to Colossus, to the first American computers, to the entire digital revolution that will transform human civilization in the late 20th century. And in the late 1940s and early 1950s, as this is beginning to happen, as the early computer industry is being born,
almost no one understands the connection because the Enigma story is still secret. Here's how secret it is. William Friedman, America's most senior cryptanalyst, the man who broke Japanese purple cipher before Pearl Harbor, gives a lecture at the National War College in 1952. He talks about the history of code breaking. He mentions breaking Japanese codes during the war. He discusses cryptographic theory. He never mentions Enigma or Ultra or any of the German code breaking. It's still too classified. British code breakers who worked at Bletchley Park go back to civilian life, to universities, to businesses, to quiet post-war careers, and they never tell anyone what they did during the war. Not their spouses, not their children. Some of them work on the same problems they worked on during the war, applying the same mathematical techniques, and nobody around them knows that they've done all this before, that they're some of the most experienced cryptanalysts in the world. Alan Turing returns to theoretical work, then gets involved in early British computing projects. He writes papers about machine intelligence and proposes what becomes known as the Turing test for artificial intelligence. He's knighted for his contributions to the war effort, but the specific nature of those contributions remains classified. In 1952, he's prosecuted for homosexuality, which is still illegal in Britain. He's convicted, stripped of his security clearance, and subjected to chemical castration. 2 years later, he dies from cyanide poisoning, an apparent suicide, though some historians will later question that conclusion. He's 41 years old. The man who did more than almost anyone to break Enigma, whose theoretical work laid the foundation for modern computing, dies in disgrace and obscurity. The world doesn't know what he accomplished. It won't know for decades.
This is what secrecy costs. This is the price of protecting sources and methods. And American intelligence, learning from the British example, embraces that same culture of secrecy. The National Security Agency, formed in 1952, becomes so secretive that its very existence isn't publicly acknowledged for years. People joke that NSA stands for No Such Agency. Employees can't tell their families what they do. Breakthroughs in cryptanalysis and signals intelligence remain classified for decades, sometimes forever. But slowly, carefully, some information begins to emerge. In the 1970s, after the British Official Secrets Act's 30-year classification period expires for World War II material, a few details about Bletchley Park start to become public. A book called The Ultra Secret by F.W. Winterbotham, published in 1974, is the first to reveal the scope of Allied code breaking to the general public. It causes a sensation. Suddenly, military historians have to rewrite their understanding of World War II. Battles that seemed like lucky Allied victories now make sense as intelligence-driven operations. German mistakes that appeared baffling now reveal themselves as responses to misinformation the Germans didn't know was false. The entire strategic narrative of the war shifts. American veterans who fought in Europe learn for the first time that their commanders had information sources they never suspected. Intelligence officers who worked on Ultra during the war can finally tell their families what they did. The women who operated Bombus in Dayton and elsewhere can finally explain why those years were so important, why they signed secrecy agreements that lasted decades. And Alan Turing, dead for 20 years, begins to receive posthumous recognition for his contributions. Slowly at first, then in a building wave. Computer scientists start acknowledging his theoretical work as foundational. Cryptographers recognize him as one of the great code breakers. By the turn of the 21st century, he's being celebrated as a hero.
In 2009, the British Prime Minister issues a formal apology for how he was treated. In 2013, he receives a royal pardon. In 2019, he's chosen to appear on the British £50 note. But here's what's remarkable. Even as the Enigma story becomes public, even as books and movies celebrate the codebreakers, the full intelligence implications remain classified for much longer. Documents about specific operations, about how ultra-intelligence was used tactically, about mistakes made and lessons learned, much of that stays secret into the 21st century. Because intelligence agencies understand something that the public doesn't always grasp. The specific techniques used to break Enigma might be obsolete, but the principles behind them aren't. The mathematical approaches, the way you analyze cipher systems for vulnerabilities, the tradecraft of signals intelligence, all of that remains relevant. If you're trying to break modern encryption, you're using descendants of the techniques developed at Bletchley Park. So the agencies stay quiet about details. They release some information, but hold back more. They allow the human interest story, brave code breakers, ingenious machines, the triumph over Nazi Germany, while protecting the nuts and bolts of how it actually worked. And this policy shocks some people, particularly in America, where there's a stronger tradition of government transparency. There are calls to declassify everything, congressional hearings, Freedom of Information Act requests, journalists demanding answers. The intelligence community pushes back. They argue that some secrets need to stay secret, not because revealing them would help Germany lost 70 years ago, but because revealing them would help current adversaries understand American capabilities. They make the case that the success of Ultra depends on the enemy never knowing what you can do, and that principle still applies.
It's a tension that never fully resolves. To this day, there are classified documents about Enigma and Bletchley Park. Not many, but some. Details about techniques that might still have intelligence value. Information about post-war operations using captured German equipment. Specifics about cooperation between Allied intelligence services that might embarrass current partner nations. The story of Enigma becomes public, but not completely public. Known, but not fully known. And that partial revelation, that carefully managed disclosure, becomes a template for how intelligence agencies handle other historical secrets. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Let's understand exactly how Enigma changed American strategic thinking, because the impact goes far beyond just breaking one German cipher system. Before World War II, intelligence was tactical. It was about knowing where enemy forces were positioned, what they were planning for the next battle. It was valuable, sure, but it was support work. The real war was fought by soldiers and sailors and airmen. Intelligence just helped them do their jobs a little better. Ultra changes that calculation entirely. For the first time in history, signals intelligence becomes strategically decisive. It doesn't just help win battles, it determines which battles get fought. It shapes entire campaigns. It allows Allied commanders to see the whole chessboard while the Germans are still trying to figure out what the board looks like. American military planners, once they're fully read into Ultra in 1943, experience what one officer later describes as a conceptual revolution. They realize that information dominance, knowing what the enemy is doing, thinking, planning, can be more valuable than numerical superiority. A smaller force with better intelligence can defeat a larger force operating blind. This realization reshapes American military doctrine for the next 80 years. It's why the United States will invest billions in signals intelligence during the Cold War.
It's why satellite reconnaissance becomes a strategic priority. It's why the National Security Agency grows into one of the largest intelligence organizations in the world. It's why decades later, cyber warfare and information operations become central to American military planning. All of it traces back to the lesson learned from Enigma. Information is a weapon, sometimes the most powerful weapon. But there's a darker side to this lesson. The success of Ultra also teaches intelligence agencies that secrecy must be absolute, that protecting sources and methods justifies almost any measure, that the end of knowing what adversaries are doing justifies the means of doing whatever it takes to maintain that knowledge. This thinking leads to some of the most controversial intelligence operations of the Cold War and beyond. When the NSA develops capabilities to intercept international communications on a massive scale, they justify it by pointing to the success of signals intelligence in World War II. When intelligence agencies argue for minimal oversight and maximum secrecy, they invoke the example of Ultra. The message is always, trust us, we know what we're doing, we're protecting the nation, and we can't tell you how because that would compromise our effectiveness. It's a powerful argument, and it works for a long time. Congress largely defers to intelligence agencies. Presidents give them wide latitude. The public, when they think about intelligence at all, imagines James Bond or spy novels, not the reality of signals intelligence and mathematical cryptanalysis. But after the Cold War ends, after the Soviet Union collapses, questions start being asked. Do we still need this level of secrecy? Are intelligence agencies operating with proper oversight? What are they doing with all these capabilities developed for signals intelligence? And then, in 2013, a former NSA contractor named Edward Snowden leaks classified documents revealing the scope of modern NSA surveillance. The revelations shock the American public. The NSA isn't just monitoring foreign adversaries. They're collecting data on American citizens. They're intercepting communications on a global scale. They're working with tech companies to build backdoors into encryption systems. The backlash is intense. Privacy advocates argue that intelligence agencies have gone too far, that they've used the justification of national security to build a surveillance apparatus that would have horrified the founders. Civil libertarians sue. Tech companies start implementing stronger encryption specifically designed to resist government access. Other countries accuse the United States of cyber imperialism. The intelligence community's response echoes arguments made since World War II. We're protecting the nation. We need these capabilities to stay ahead of adversaries. Limiting our access to communications will get people killed. They point to terrorist attacks prevented, to threats detected and neutralized. They argue that signals intelligence is more important than ever in an age of global terrorism and cyber threats. But here's what's different now. The public knows what's possible. They understand, in a way previous generations didn't, that their communications can be intercepted, that their data can be collected, that encryption can be broken. The mystique of signals intelligence, carefully maintained since the Enigma era, has been partially stripped away. And this creates a fascinating historical irony. Enigma succeeded as a military cipher system for years because most people, including German commanders, didn't understand that such complex codes could be broken. They trusted their encryption because they couldn't imagine the mathematical techniques needed to attack it. That ignorance was, in a sense, part of the system's security.
Alan Turing carried his own burdens. He knew the importance of what he'd accomplished. He knew he'd helped save countless lives. But he couldn't talk about it, couldn't publish papers about it, couldn't receive public recognition for it. And then, when his homosexuality was discovered, he was persecuted by the very government he'd served so effectively. He was judged a security risk, stripped of his clearance,
subjected to chemical treatment that destroyed his health and his spirit. Did the secrecy contribute to his death? Did the isolation, the inability to discuss his wartime work, the knowledge that his contributions were unrecognized, did that make his despair worse? We can't know. But we can acknowledge that secrecy has a price, and sometimes that price is measured in human suffering. The Polish codebreakers had their own tragedies. Jerzy Różdżicki died in 1942 when a ship carrying him from France to North Africa sank in a storm. He was only 31 years old. He'd spent his brief adult life breaking codes for his country, first in Poland, then in exile, and he died in the middle of the war he'd done so much to help win. Marian Różewski and Henryk Zygalski survived the war, but they returned to a Poland occupied by the Soviet Union, living under communist rule. They couldn't talk about their work. It remained classified by the British and Americans for decades, and the Soviets had their own reasons to suppress information about Polish contributions to the Allied victory. Różewski worked as an accountant. An accountant, one of the most brilliant mathematical minds of the 20th century, the man who first broke Enigma, spent his post-war years balancing books for a factory. He didn't receive recognition until the 1970s, when the Enigma story finally became public. He was in his 60s by then, an old man whose greatest achievements were decades in the past. He gave some interviews, explained his work to historians, and died in 1980, with his contributions finally acknowledged but never adequately celebrated. These stories matter. They're part of the Enigma legacy too. The secrecy that protected the intelligence source also imprisoned the people who created it. They were heroes who couldn't be recognized, geniuses whose work had to be hidden, patriots whose service to their countries remained unknown even to their own families. And this pattern repeats throughout the history of signals intelligence. People do classified work that's strategically important, and they can't talk about it. They make sacrifices nobody knows about. They carry secrets to their graves. Sometimes literally. There are Bletchley Park veterans who died in the 1960s and 1970s without ever telling their families what they did during the war. Is this necessary? Is this the price that must be paid for national security? Or is it excessive, a kind of institutional paranoia that persists beyond reasonable need? These are questions that American intelligence agencies, inheritors of the Ultra legacy, still struggle with. When does classification protect security, and when does it simply protect institutions from accountability? When is secrecy a tool of national defense, and when is it a shield for abuse? The Enigma story doesn't answer these questions, but it raises them in stark form. It shows us both the value of signals intelligence and the cost of keeping it secret. It demonstrates that sometimes secrecy is necessary for success, and it also shows that secrecy can be cruelly inhuman. Here we are, 80 years after the height of the Enigma War, and we're still dealing with the consequences. Still living in the world that Enigma made, still grappling with questions it raised. The machine is obsolete. The specific codes it generated are irrelevant, but the impact reverberates through our time like ripples spreading across water from a stone thrown decades ago. Let's start with the most obvious legacy, modern cryptography. Every time you make a purchase online, every time you send an encrypted message, every time your phone establishes a secure connection to a website, you're using encryption technology that descends directly from lessons learned during the Enigma era. The Enigma experience taught cryptographers several critical lessons. First, complexity alone doesn't guarantee security. Enigma was fiendishly complex, and it was still broken. What matters isn't just how complicated your cipher is, but whether it has mathematical vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Second, key management is crucial. Many Enigma breaks came not from flaws in the machine itself, but from operator errors, from German military procedures that weren't quite careful enough. Modern encryption systems obsess over key management, over making sure that even if humans are involved, human error can't completely compromise security. Third, security through obscurity doesn't work. The Germans believed Enigma was secure because they thought nobody could figure out how it worked. But the Allies captured machines, recruited informants, and reverse-engineered the system. Modern cryptography operates on the principle that your system should be secure even if the adversary knows exactly how it works. The security should be in the keys, not in keeping the algorithm secret. These principles shape everything about modern encryption, from the algorithms in your phone to the systems protecting banking transactions to the classified communications used by military and intelligence agencies. Enigma taught us how to think about encryption correctly. But there's a darker legacy too. The success of Ultra convinced intelligence agencies that signals intelligence is worth almost any investment, any effort, any compromise. This leads to the massive electronic surveillance infrastructure that exists today. Satellite monitoring systems, undersea cable taps, partnerships with telecommunications companies, supercomputers dedicated to breaking encryption. All of it justified by the memory of what signals intelligence accomplished during World War II. The NSA, formed in 1952, grows into one of the largest employers of mathematicians in the world. They recruit from top universities, offering salaries and research opportunities that compete with private industry. They work on problems at the cutting edge of mathematics and computer science, and they do it all in secret, behind classification barriers that prevent public scrutiny or academic peer review. This creates a strange bifurcation in cryptography research. There's public cryptography, studied openly at universities and published in journals, and there's classified cryptography, developed in the hidden world of intelligence agencies. Sometimes the two realms advance in parallel, independently inventing the same techniques. Sometimes the classified world is years or decades ahead. We don't know. That's the point of classification. But we can see the effects. When encryption standards are proposed for public use, there's always suspicion that intelligence agencies have influenced their design, inserting subtle weaknesses that allow government access. Sometimes these suspicions are paranoid, sometimes they're proven correct. In 2013, leaked documents revealed that the NSA had indeed worked to weaken encryption standards, to make them breakable by methods the agency possessed. This creates a crisis of trust. If you can't trust that publicly available encryption is actually secure, what can you trust? Engineers start designing systems specifically to resist government surveillance. Privacy advocates promote end-to-end encryption that even service providers can't break. Criminals and terrorists use these same tools to hide from law enforcement. And intelligence agencies argue, with some justice, that they're being handicapped in their mission to protect national security. They point out that terrorists communicate using encrypted channels, that child predators use anonymous networks, that adversary nations are developing cyber weapons. They need tools to combat these threats, and those tools include the ability to break or bypass encryption. It's the same tension that existed during the Enigma era: security versus access,
Privacy versus intelligence. The freedom to communicate securely versus the need to monitor threats. We haven't resolved it. We probably can't resolve it. It's a permanent feature of the landscape that Enigma created. Then there's the computing legacy. This one is harder to trace precisely because so much was classified for so long, but the connections are real. The bombs that broke Enigma were specialized computers, designed for a specific task but using principles that applied more broadly. Colossus was even more clearly a computer in the modern sense, using electronic switching and programmable logic. The people who built these machines, who worked on them, who understood what they could do, they took that knowledge into the post-war world. Not directly because of classification, but in their thinking, in their understanding of what was possible. When commercial computers start being developed in the 1950s, some of the engineers have backgrounds in wartime intelligence. They don't talk about where their ideas came from, but the ideas are there, shaped by experiences they can't discuss. Alan Turing's theoretical work on computing, published before the war, becomes foundational to computer science. But his practical experience at Bletchley Park, his understanding of how machines could perform logical operations at high speed, his insights into what would later be called artificial intelligence, all of that was informed by his code-breaking work. He couldn't publish directly about it, but it shaped everything he thought about afterward. There's a fascinating counterfactual question. How much faster would computing have developed if the Bletchley Park work had been public? If Colossus had been written about in engineering journals? If the techniques developed for cryptanalysis had been available to the broader research community? We developed computers anyway, obviously. But did classification slow the process by years, by decades? We'll never know, but it's worth considering that some of the most important developments in 20th century technology happened in secret, behind walls of classification, and only contributed to public knowledge obliquely and years after the fact. Here's another legacy. The special relationship between American and British intelligence. The collaboration on Ultra during World War II created institutional connections that persist today. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, shares signals intelligence in ways that other allied nations don't. This arrangement traces directly back to wartime cooperation on code breaking. And it's controversial. Other NATO allies, learning in recent years about the extent of Five Eyes surveillance, have felt betrayed. Why is Britain given access to American intelligence that France or Germany isn't? Why do Anglophone countries have this special status? The answer, at least partly, is Ultra. The answer is relationships built during the war and never fully dissolved. Finally, there's a cultural legacy. The Enigma story, once it became public, captured popular imagination in a way few intelligence stories do. There have been books, documentaries, movies, most famously The Imitation Game in 2014, starring Benedict Cumberbatch as Alan Turing. These portrayals are often simplified, sometimes fictionalized, but they've brought the story to millions of people who might never read a technical history. And that's important, because the Enigma story is, ultimately, a story about the power of human intelligence, not intelligence in the spy sense, but in the mental sense. It's a story about mathematicians and engineers solving problems that seemed unsolvable, about persistence in the face of apparently impossible odds, about how brilliant people, working together, can accomplish things that seem like magic.
In a world that often celebrates athletic or military prowess, the Enigma story celebrates intellectual achievement. It makes heroes of mathematicians, of women operating complex machines, of people whose weapons were symbols and equations rather than guns and bombs. That's a valuable cultural message. But we should be careful not to over-romanticize. Yes, the code breakers were brilliant and brave, but they were also serving governments that made morally complicated choices. The intelligence they provided helped win a necessary war against fascism, but it also enabled decisions about which cities to protect and which to abandon, which convoys to save and which to let be attacked. The technology they developed has given us both the internet and mass surveillance. The Enigma legacy is complex, morally complex, strategically complex, technologically complex. We can celebrate the achievements while acknowledging the problems. We can honor the code breakers while questioning some of the systems their success created. We can be grateful for the role signals intelligence played in defeating Nazi Germany, while remaining vigilant about how those same capabilities might be misused today. So let's return to where we started. The Atlantic Ocean in 1942. Ships sinking. American officers staring at maps, trying to understand how the Germans always seem to know where their convoys will be. What shocked the United States about Enigma wasn't just that the Germans had such a sophisticated encryption system. Other countries had cipher machines too. Japan had its purple cipher. The Soviets had their own systems. Encryption was expected in modern warfare. What shocked America was the scale of what the Allies had achieved in breaking it. The industrial approach to code breaking, the mathematical sophistication, the technological innovation, the institutional commitment, the sheer audacity of believing that a code with more than 100 quintillion possible settings could be broken and then actually doing it. American intelligence in 1941 wasn't prepared for this. They weren't thinking about signals intelligence as a strategic capability. They had talented cryptanalysts like William Friedman, certainly, and they had some successes against Japanese codes, but they weren't operating on the level that Bletchley Park had achieved. The British and Polish code breakers showed them what was possible. They demonstrated that with enough mathematical talent, enough computing power, even the primitive computing power of bombs and colossi, enough institutional support, and enough operational security, you could turn signals intelligence into a war-winning capability. And America, characteristically, learned the lesson and then doubled down on it. They built more bombs than the British. They created larger organizations. They invested more money. They recruited more mathematicians. They systematized and industrialized code breaking the way they systematized and industrialized everything else. By the end of the war, American signals intelligence had gone from a backwater operation to a sophisticated capability that rivaled Britain's. And after the war, when the British Empire was in decline and couldn't maintain the same level of investment, American intelligence ascended. The NSA became the premier signals intelligence agency in the world, a position it has maintained ever since, all because of lessons learned from Enigma. But those lessons came with warnings attached. The British showed Americans what was possible, yes, but they also showed them the costs, the need for absolute secrecy, the moral compromises involved in intelligence work, the human toll on people who carry secrets they can't share, the danger of becoming so focused on signals intelligence that you neglect other forms of intelligence gathering. America learned those lessons too, sometimes the hard way. Vietnam War intelligence failures, Iran-Contra, the weapons of mass destruction debacle in Iraq, September 11th, when al-Qaeda terrorists communicated through channels that signals intelligence couldn't penetrate. Each failure prompted soul-searching about whether intelligence capabilities had been oversold, whether secrecy had been excessive, whether different approaches were needed.
But Enigma's fundamental lesson remains: information is power. Knowing what your adversary is thinking, planning, communicating, that's worth enormous effort and investment. And protecting your own communications so adversaries can't do the same to you is equally vital. We live in an era when more human communication is mediated by technology than ever before. Everything we say, everything we write, everything we search for online, it's all potentially interceptable, potentially analyzable. The descendants of Enigma-breaking technology are all around us, invisible but omnipresent. Intelligence agencies with capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction in 1945 now operate routinely. And we're still arguing about the same questions. How much surveillance is too much? What should governments be allowed to know? How do we balance security and privacy? Where's the line between protecting citizens and oppressing them?
Enigma doesn't answer these questions, but it frames them. It shows us both the power and the peril of signals intelligence. It demonstrates what becomes possible when mathematical genius meets institutional commitment. And it warns us that the tools we create to defeat our enemies can become tools of control over our own people. The machine itself is obsolete. You can see Enigma machines in museums now, quaint artifacts of a bygone era. They're surprisingly small, surprisingly simple-looking for devices that once seemed impossibly complex. You can turn the rotors with your hand, see how the electrical contacts connect, understand the mechanism that once encrypted Germany's most secret communications. But the machine's legacy is very much alive. It's in every encrypted message you send. It's in the intelligence agencies monitoring global communications. It's in the computers that descended from bombs and Colossus. It's in the special relationship between English-speaking intelligence services. It's in the ongoing debate about privacy and security in a digital age. The Enigma machine shocked the United States by revealing what signals intelligence could accomplish, by showing that codes believed unbreakable could be broken, by demonstrating that information could be weaponized, industrialized, turned into a strategic advantage that might be more valuable than tanks or ships or aircraft. That shockwaves continued to ripple through our world today. Every time you hear about NSA surveillance, or encryption policy debates, or cyber warfare, or the latest developments in quantum computing and post-quantum cryptography, you're seeing Enigma's legacy play out in real time. The three Polish mathematicians who first broke Enigma in 1932 couldn't have imagined where their work would lead. Alan Turing, building bombs at Bletchley Park, probably didn't foresee that his theoretical work on computing would become the foundation for a technological revolution. The American officers first learning about Ultra in 1943 certainly didn't predict that signals intelligence would remain a cornerstone of U.S. military strategy 80 years later. But that's how history works. A German engineer creates a cipher machine to protect business communications. Polish mathematicians figure out how to break it. The British industrialize code breaking. Americans learn from them and push the technology even further. And from this chain of events comes modern computing, mass surveillance, contemporary debates about privacy and security, and a world where information is understood as a form of power. The Enigma machine was a tool, just a tool, a clever electromechanical device for scrambling messages. But it changed everything. It changed how wars are fought. It changed how intelligence agencies operate. It changed our understanding of what's possible with mathematics and technology. It changed the world.
And that might be the most important lesson of all. Technologies that seem specialized, that appear to have limited applications, can have consequences far beyond anything their creators imagined. The choices we make about those technologies, how we use them, who controls them, what rules govern them, those choices matter. They matter for decades, for generations, perhaps forever. We're still living with the choices made during the Enigma era, still benefiting from some of them, still struggling with others, still trying to find the balance between security and liberty, between secrecy and transparency, between the power that comes from knowing and the freedom that comes from privacy. The Enigma machine is silent now. The rotors no longer turn, the lamps no longer light, but its echoes continue, reverberating through our digital age, reminding us that the most powerful machines are sometimes the ones that deal not in physical force, but in information, not in destruction, but in knowledge. That's how the Enigma machine shocked the United States, not just by existing, but by revealing what was possible, by opening doors that could never be closed again, by starting us down a path we're still walking, toward a future where information and computing power reshape the very nature of warfare, intelligence, privacy, and human society itself. The story of Enigma isn't finished. It's still being written every day in intelligence agencies and tech companies, in legislative debates and courtrooms, in the invisible infrastructure of our connected world. The machine itself belongs to history, but its legacy belongs to the future, our future. And how that story continues depends on choices we haven't yet made, about technologies we're still developing, in a world that the Enigma codebreakers helped create but couldn't have predicted. That's the final shock, realizing that we're still living in Enigma's world, still dealing with questions it raised, still trying to understand the implications of what those mathematicians and engineers discovered when they proved that the impossible was merely difficult, that the unbreakable could be broken, that information itself could become the most powerful weapon of all.